I have always loved being alone at home. It's peaceful, a break from the chaos of the world. But one night changed everything. It was the scariest night of my life, and I want to share it with you. It started like any other evening. My parents were out of town, visiting friends in the countryside. They trusted me to take care of our house, a big place on the edge of a small town in Ohio. The clock showed 8 p.m. I settled on the couch with a bowl of popcorn and my favorite horror movie. Our golden retriever, Max, lay beside me. He's always by my side, even when I go to the bathroom. The house, surrounded by a thick forest, always felt welcoming. But that night, it felt too quiet, almost creepy. Halfway through the movie, around 10 p.m., I heard a faint knock on the front door. My heart skipped a beat. It was strange for anyone to visit that late. I paused the movie and listened. Max lifted his head but didn't seem alarmed. The knock came again, louder this time. I got up, Max following me, and peered through the peephole. No one was there. I turned on the porch light, hoping to scare away any pranksters, but there was no one. I shrugged it off, thinking it might have been the wind, and went back to the living room. I was just about to resume my movie when the power went out. The sudden darkness swallowed the room, and my heart pounded. Max started growling softly. I fumbled for my phone and used its flashlight to navigate the dark house. My unease grew stronger. I made my way to the kitchen where the main electrical panel was located. As I was about to open it, I heard a creak from upstairs. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. Max's growling grew louder, and he stood protectively in front of me. I called out, my voice trembling, but there was no response. Just deafening silence. I grabbed a flashlight from a drawer and started up the stairs, Max at my heels. Each step creaked loudly. I reached the top and turned toward my parents' bedroom where I thought I heard the noise. The door was slightly open, and I could see a faint light inside. Panicking, I pushed the door open. The room was empty, but the TV was on, showing static. I knew I had turned everything off before coming downstairs. A cold shiver ran down my spine. I turned off the TV and checked the other rooms. Entering my own bedroom, I was greeted by an icy draft. The window was wide open, curtains fluttering in the breeze. Panic set in. Someone had been in the house. I shut the window and locked it, my hands trembling. I locked myself and Max in the bathroom, waiting and listening. Every small noise made me jump. I called the cops, trying to keep my voice steady. They assured me they would send someone over right away. After some time, I heard a knock on the front door, followed by sirens. Relief washed over me. I hurried downstairs and let the officers in. They searched the house but found no signs of forced entry or anyone hiding. The cops suggested it was probably a prank but promised to keep a patrol car nearby just in case. Even now, I am sure they didn't believe me. They either thought I was just a scared kid alone or that I was playing a prank on them. I wasn't going to stay in that house to prove them wrong. I worried about Max's safety, my best friend and constant companion. I called a friend and asked if I could stay at his place. He didn't hesitate to say yes, hearing the panic in my voice. I grabbed my wallet and phone and got out of there right away. I was already in the car with Max when I glanced in the rearview mirror. The house was completely dark except for a faint light coming from the basement window. I was sure I wasn't alone in that house and that the police had dismissed my situation. The next morning, my friend and 3 college friends accompanied me back to the house. What we found left me terrified. The house was wrecked from top to bottom. We called the cops again, and this time they couldn't doubt me. My parents rushed back home, and after the investigation, we found out that the culprit was an old childhood friend of my father's. They had unresolved issues, and this man had grown to resent him. My dad had long forgotten about him, and the trigger was their chance encounter at Walmart where my dad failed to recognize him. I still can't understand the mindset of someone so bitter that they could do such a thing. I try not to dwell on what might have happened if Max and I had stayed there. Now, whenever I'm alone in the house, I make sure all the doors and windows are locked. We installed security cameras and motion sensors around the property. But despite all the precautions, I still can't shake the memory of that night. The fear that it could happen again. Being alone used to bring me peace. Now, it only brings me anxiety. Scared yet? Please hit on the subscribe button, or maybe you will face something as I did. It was a late autumn evening, and I had the house to myself. My wife was out of town for a conference, and our 2 kids were staying with my in-laws for the weekend. The house was quiet, and I was looking forward to some rare alone time. But this night turned into the scariest night of my life, and I want to share it with you. After dinner, I decided to watch a light-hearted movie to fill the house with comforting sounds. As the movie played, I felt relaxed, enjoying the peace and quiet. But halfway through, I got up to make myself a cup of tea. As I walked into the kitchen, I noticed the back door was unlocked. I distinctly remembered locking it earlier. A slight sense of unease crept in. I shook my head, thinking I must have forgotten. I locked the door, double-checking it this time, and returned to the living room with my tea. When the movie started again, I had trouble focusing. My mind kept drifting back to the unlocked door. Had I really been that absent-minded? I tried to ignore it, but the unease lingered. For many people, this might seem strange and a bit extreme, thinking so much about an unlocked door, but I've always been careful about these things. Eventually, I turned off the TV and decided to call it a night. As I went through the house, turning off lights and checking doors, I felt a strange compulsion to look out the windows each time. I half expected to see someone standing outside, watching, but the yard was empty, bathed in the soft glow of the streetlights. Upstairs, I got ready for bed, but the feeling persisted. I left a lamp on in the hallway, something I hadn't done since we first moved into the house. Lying in bed, I heard it, a faint noise coming from downstairs. It was barely perceptible, but in the silence of the house, it sounded loud and intrusive. My heart rate quickened, and I strained to hear it again. There it was, a soft thud followed by a creak. I told myself it was just the house settling, old and prone to making noises, but a part of me wasn't convinced. I got out of bed, my bare feet cold against the hardwood floor. I grabbed a small pocket knife from the bedside table and started to make my way down the stairs. The living room was just as I had left it. I moved through the house, checking each room. The kitchen, dining room, and bathroom were all empty. I checked the back door again. It was still locked. As I moved towards the front of the house, I noticed the front door was slightly open. My heart skipped a beat. This time, I was sure I had locked it. I stepped closer, my breath catching in my throat. Someone had been, or was still, inside the house. The door had a security mechanism and could only have been opened from the inside. Without thinking twice, I approached and opened the door, prepared to see someone on the other side. But there was no one. I quickly went to the kitchen, grabbed a bigger knife, and shouted into the emptiness that I was armed and wouldn't hesitate to defend myself. Then I went from room to room, checking every corner of the house, making absolutely sure no one was inside. I returned to the bedroom where I had left my phone to call the police, but just before I could dial 911, I heard another noise. This time, it was distinctly clear, coming from the direction of the garage. It was a metallic sound, like something being moved or bumped. I sat up, listening intently. The garage was accessible from the house through a door in the kitchen. Hadn't I checked it earlier? I was absolutely certain I had, but under the pressure of the situation, I began to doubt myself. I slipped out of the bedroom again, my body tense with apprehension. I made my way downstairs, phone flashlight in hand. In the kitchen, I stood before the door to the garage, listening. Silence. I turned the knob slowly and opened the door, shining my light into the darkness. The garage was cluttered as usual, boxes, tools, and bikes piled carelessly. Nothing seemed out of place, but the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. I stepped inside, the cool air wrapping around me. I scanned the room with my light, half expecting to see someone hiding. Suddenly, the overhead light flickered on. I jumped, my heart racing, and spun around to see the motion sensor had been triggered. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. It was just the light reacting to my movement. I turned to leave, but as I reached the door, I noticed something on the floor. It was a small folded piece of paper. I picked it up, my hands trembling slightly. When I opened it, I discovered a written note: "You should lock your doors." A chill ran down my spine. Someone had been here. They had been close enough to leave this note, yet I had seen no one. Panic surged through me. I needed to call the police. Forcing myself to move, I ran back into the kitchen, slamming the door shut behind me. I locked it and backed away, grabbing my phone and dialing 911 again. As I spoke to the operator, I felt a mix of fear and frustration. They assured me an officer would be dispatched, but I knew it would take some time. I stayed on the line, moving through the house to check every lock and window. I felt exposed, vulnerable, despite the reassurances from the operator. When the police finally arrived, I felt a flood of relief. I let them in and explained everything, showing them the note. They searched the house and the surrounding area but found no one. The officer in charge was sympathetic, but there wasn't much they could do beyond filing a report and increasing patrols in the neighborhood. I spent the rest of the night obsessively thinking about what had happened. Nothing had been stolen, and no one had tried to interact with me. Was it a warning that they might return later when my family was home? It's terrifying to think about someone invading our privacy without any apparent purpose. I would have felt much more at ease if they had taken something concrete. The next few days were a blur of anxiety and hypervigilance. I couldn't bring myself to stay at the house alone. I arranged for a security system to be installed, complete with cameras and alarms. It brought some peace of mind, but the sense of safety I once had was shattered. Weeks passed, and life slowly returned to a semblance of normalcy. My wife and kids came home, and the house was filled with noise and activity once more. But the memory of that night lingered. I found myself double-checking locks and windows, listening intently to every creak and groan of the house. The police never found out who left the note, and there were no further incidents. But the experience left a mark on me. I had always considered myself level-headed and rational, but that night showed me how quickly fear could take hold. It was a lesson in vigilance, in the fragility of the sense of security we often take for granted. Now, as I sit in my living room surrounded by the comforting sounds of my family, I can't help but glance at the windows, checking for shadows that don't belong. The fear has faded, but the awareness remains. I know I'll never forget that night, the feeling of being alone and vulnerable, and the reminder that safety is something we can never truly take for granted. When I was 17, my parents went on a short trip to visit relatives, leaving me alone in our big, old farmhouse. The house was surrounded by dense forests and far from any neighbors. I usually enjoyed the solitude, but that weekend turned into the scariest experience of my life, and I want to share it with you. My parents left early Friday morning. I was excited about having the house to myself. That evening, I played video games in the living room, feeling free and relaxed. Around 11 p.m., I decided to call it a night and headed to bed. As I was drifting off to sleep, I heard a loud bang coming from the barn at the edge of our property. My heart raced. I grabbed a flashlight from my nightstand and crept downstairs. The house was silent except for the sound of the wind rustling the leaves outside. I slipped on my shoes and stepped into the cool night air. The moon cast an eerie glow over the landscape. I walked towards the barn, the gravel crunching under my feet. The door was slightly open. I knew I had closed it earlier. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness as I stepped inside. The barn was filled with old tools and hay bales. I called out, "Hello," but there was no response. I moved deeper into the barn, the air thick with dust and mold. Suddenly, I heard a rustling sound from one of the hay piles. My heart pounded in my chest as I approached it. Just as I was about to lift the edge of the hay, something darted out and scurried away. I jumped back, nearly dropping my flashlight. It was just a raccoon. I let out a sigh of relief and laughed at myself for being so jumpy. I decided to head back to the house and get some rest. As I walked back, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I glanced over my shoulder several times but saw nothing out of the ordinary. However, halfway there, I noticed something strange. The ground was still muddy from rain a few days before, and my footprints were clearly visible. Among my own tracks, there was another set, larger than mine. A chill ran down my spine. Someone had been here. I quickened my pace, reached the house, and locked the door behind me. I checked all the windows and doors, making sure everything was secure. I went back to bed but couldn't sleep. Every little noise seemed amplified in the stillness of the night. The next day, I tried to forget about the incident. I went about my usual routine, but the memory of those footprints lingered in my mind. By evening, I was feeling more at ease. I cooked myself dinner and watched a movie to pass the time. Halfway through the movie, the power suddenly went out. The house was plunged into darkness. I fumbled for my flashlight, the beam cutting through the blackness. I made my way to the fuse box in the basement, but everything seemed in order. I flipped the switches a few times, but nothing happened. Just as I was about to head back upstairs, I heard a faint tapping sound coming from one of the basement windows. My blood ran cold. I slowly approached the window, the flashlight beam dancing across the walls. When I reached the window, I saw a pair of eyes staring back at me from the darkness outside. I screamed and stumbled backward, dropping the flashlight. I slammed the basement door shut and locked it. My hands were shaking as I grabbed my cell phone and dialed 911. As I spoke to the operator, I heard footsteps outside the house, tapping on the windows. The operator assured me that a patrol car was on its way. I huddled in a corner of the living room, clutching the phone and the flashlight. After what felt like an eternity, I saw the flashing lights of the police car approaching the house. The footsteps stopped, and there was silence. The officers searched the property but found no sign of anyone. They told me it was probably just a prank, but they would keep an eye on the area. I thanked them and watched as they drove away. I felt a little better knowing they were nearby, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. I decided to stay in the living room for the rest of the night with all the lights on and the phone by my side. Around 3 a.m., I finally drifted off to sleep, only to be woken by a loud crash. I jumped up, the flashlight slipping from my grasp. I grabbed it and shone the beam toward the sound. The front door was wide open, and a cold breeze was blowing into the house. I slowly approached the door, my hands shaking. As I reached the doorway, I saw a figure standing at the edge of the yard, just beyond the reach of the flashlight. They were wearing a long coat and a hat, and I couldn't see their face. I called out, "Who are you? What do you want?" But there was no response. The figure just stood there, watching me. I took a step back and reached for the phone to call the police again. As I dialed, the figure turned and disappeared into the woods. The operator answered, and I quickly explained what had happened. They told me to stay inside and lock all the doors and windows, and that they were sending another patrol car. I spent the remaining 2 hours of the night completely on edge. Even though I knew the police were there with me, I still felt that strange sensation that the man could reach me at any moment. When morning finally came, I packed a bag and decided to stay with a friend until my parents returned. As I drove away from the house, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw him standing at the edge of the woods, watching me leave. I never found out who it was or what they wanted, but the experience haunted me for years. I moved out of the house as soon as I could and never went back. Even now, whenever I'm alone in the dark, I can't help but feel like someone is watching me. That night changed everything for me. It was the most terrifying experience of my life, and it taught me that safety is something we can never take for granted. If you found this story chilling and engaging, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Don't miss out on more real-life horror stories like this. Subscribe now, or you might just find yourself facing the same horrors I did. Trust me, you don't want to experience this kind of fear alone.